It was supposed to be just another panel, another polished production, another hour of talking points wrapped in applause. But beneath the lights and the makeup, something was off. Kash Patel sat at the far end of the table. Not slouched, not tense, just still, like someone who had learned long ago not to react too quickly, to let others run out of breath before offering one of his own. The host introduced the guests with forced charm. One by one, names were said with flourish, titles, accolades. Patel's name came last, shortest bio, quickest nod, as if his presence required no explanation, or perhaps deserved none. They were halfway through a question about national security when it happened. A woman across from him, a rising political star with a winning smile and a voice fine-tuned for viral sound bites, laughed lightly and said, "Well, I guess we all know why he was brought on. It's the optics, right?" She didn't say, "diversity hire." She didn't have to. The laughter started softly. The host smiled too quickly, already pivoting to the next segment. The room moved on, but Patel didn't. He didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He didn't lean forward like the others did when the heat was on. He just looked at her, not with rage, not even with hurt. Just a gaze so steady it made the temperature in the room drop like a window had been cracked open in the middle of winter. The camera didn't cut away. It lingered for once. 3 seconds too long. In that stillness, in that narrowing silence, Patel reached up and unpinned his microphone. No rush, no drama, just precision. He stood, adjusted his jacket, took a breath, and then, calmly, firmly, like someone who had just decided to stop pretending, he said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." No raised voice, no pointing finger, just words delivered like a sentence already served. And then he walked off the set, live, mid-broadcast, without looking back. The others blinked. The host fumbled. Someone in the crew whispered, "Cut to commercial." But it was too late. The moment had already aired, and someone had already clipped it, posted it, captioned it with just the words. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the bar. By the end of the hour, one biggest mistake was trending. But no one, not the audience, not the panel, not even the host, understood what they had just witnessed. Not yet. Because this wasn't outrage. This wasn't cancellation. This was the beginning of a silence that would speak louder than anyone expected. When Kash Patel walked off that set, he didn't slam the door. He didn't wait for cameras to follow. He didn't even ask for his car. He just walked, down the hallway, past the dressing rooms, out into the open air. One producer stood frozen near the monitors, a coffee cup trembling slightly in their hand. Someone from PR was already whispering into a phone, repeating one line again and again. He just left. On camera, he just left. Inside the studio, the air didn't settle. It calcified. The laughter had dried up, not because anyone felt guilt, but because they suddenly weren't sure what they'd been laughing at. The panel tried to pivot. They stumbled through the next topic, but every word landed with a thud. The moment had broken something. It wasn't obvious, not yet, but it was there. A sliver in the polished glass, a crack, not wide, but growing. Meanwhile, online, it was already happening. Someone had clipped the footage straight from the live stream. Just 16 seconds, the smirk, the comment, the pause, Patel's calm rise, the line, "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." The clip had no music, no edits, no need for dramatization, because the moment was the drama. Because sometimes the absence of reaction is more powerful than 1,000 counterpoints. It started with a single tweet, then a screen recording, then a stitched TikTok with just a whisper behind it. I've waited my whole life to see someone walk away like that. Comments poured in like a wave rising without warning. He didn't explain himself. He made her question hers. Silence. Precision. No theatrics. That's how you command a room. This wasn't a clapback. This was an exit wound. People didn't just repost it. They annotated it. They replayed the 3-second stare. They paused it right at the moment Patel stood up, frame by frame, like analysts dissecting the anatomy of quiet defiance. And it wasn't just political. It wasn't even just cultural. It was personal. A young teacher in Detroit posted, "Every time I kept quiet in a meeting where someone said I was only hired for inclusion, this is the moment I wished I had." A law student in D.C. wrote, "He said everything I ever wanted to say without saying too much." And somewhere in a newsroom, a junior producer watching the clip whispered, "We're not coming back from this." Back in the studio, the energy had drained out of the room. The panel moved on, but the spark was gone. Every smile looked rehearsed. Every joke missed its mark. Even the host, known for his unshakable polish, sipped his water with a hand that now slightly trembled. Someone on the crew pulled up Twitter mid-segment. Eyes widened, heads turned. No one said it aloud, but they all saw it. 1.2 million views in 17 minutes. No hashtags, no promotions, just raw resonance. The damage wasn't reputational, it was foundational. Because Patel hadn't stormed out in anger. He hadn't made a speech. He hadn't demanded apologies. He had just left, and in doing so, he'd made it clear. Not everything deserves a rebuttal. Some things just deserve a boundary. Outside the building, Patel stood near the edge of the street watching cars pass. His phone buzzed once, twice. He didn't look at it. He was staring at the sky. Gray clouds drifting slowly, as if deciding whether the storm had passed or was just beginning. He said nothing. But inside, a shift had occurred. For years, he had stayed in the chair, taken the bait, swallowed the barbs, laughed politely. This time he chose not to stay, not to smile, not to validate. And in doing so, he didn't just walk out of a studio. He walked into something else entirely. A reckoning, a movement, a moment that no one watching could unsee. The moment didn't explode. It spread. Not like a scandal, not like a trending topic, but like a breath, held, then shared. At first, it was just the clip, posted without caption by an unknown account. No commentary, no hashtags, just 16 seconds. The video didn't begin with words. It began with a stare, Kash Patel's stare. Not of defiance, of recognition, of someone who had finally decided, no more. Then the sound. You just made the biggest mistake of your career. No fury, no drama, just an unmistakable certainty that something had shifted and would not shift back. In the first hour, it hit 1 million views. By hour 3, it had its own rhythm. Not virality through noise, but through recognition. Teachers paused their lessons to show it. Diversity officers in corporate offices replayed it silently during lunch breaks, glancing at their co-workers with quiet knowing. Even pastors quoted it, not as vengeance, but as a parable of presence. The phrase became a mirror. You just made the biggest mistake of your career. People weren't using it to gloat. They were using it to remember. To name that moment they stayed quiet when they should have walked away. To rewrite the part of their story where they swallowed disrespect in the name of staying employed, or accepted, or visible. On a podcast that week, a former diplomat said, "It's not just what he said, it's what he didn't say after. He left a sentence open and made the whole country finish it for him." A fashion brand put the quote on a shirt, but it wasn't about the merch. It was about the silence behind the statement. No design, no embellishment, just the phrase in black on white. It sold out in 24 hours. Not because it was loud, because it spoke. By the end of the day, Patel had said nothing. No interviews, no tweets, no statement to clarify. And that silence, that deliberate withholding, was louder than anything he could have said. Because we live in a time where everything is explained, defended, rationalized in real time. But Patel refused to explain a moment that had already spoken for itself. And so the world listened harder. A think piece appeared in a small online journal titled, "When Silence Becomes Leadership." It was shared 3,000 times in under a day. Lawyers posted it, activists quoted it. So did stay-at-home dads and HR reps and teenagers who had never seen Patel speak before that clip. Meanwhile, at the network, panic brewed. Damage control meetings, frantic calls, an internal email thread titled simply, "The Incident." The panelist who made the joke? She posted a tweet that night. It read, "I was joking. I've always supported inclusion. Let's not take things out of context." The replies were merciless. Not cruel, but surgical. Sometimes a joke reveals more than it hides. He wasn't offended. He was finished. You said it like it wouldn't matter. It did. But what stood out the most was the comment someone left beneath the clip when it reached its 10th millionth view. "This isn't a man walking out. This is a generation reaching its limit." In a university classroom, a professor paused a lecture on political rhetoric and played the clip. Then asked, "What did Patel say without saying it?" A student raised her hand, quietly, almost reluctantly. He said, "You don't get to define me." The professor nodded, but said nothing, because in that moment there was nothing more to add. Elsewhere, a high school debate team watched it on a projector. At first, they argued over whether it was the right move, whether he should have stayed and fought back with facts. But by the end of the period, one student stood up and said, maybe he didn't need to prove anything. Maybe walking away was the argument. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was clarity. It was a boundary laid so clean that the world had to stop and look at the line and ask themselves whether they'd ever dared draw it too. And so Kash Patel became a name spoken not with outrage or applause, but with reflection. He hadn't slammed the door on his way out. He left it open, so others could see what it meant to stop performing, to stop justifying, to stop being grateful for being allowed in, and start demanding what should have been his to begin with: respect, without pretext, presence, without permission. Kash Patel wasn't born into silence. He learned it. Not the kind of silence that hides, the kind that observes, the kind that waits for the right moment to speak, if it speaks at all. He was the son of immigrants, a child raised in the duality of gratitude and grit. His parents never taught him to demand space. They taught him to earn it, to take up less room until the room noticed he was still there, to nod at jokes that weren't really jokes, because questioning them might make others uncomfortable, to measure every word as if it were currency, valuable, limited, and always at risk of being used against him. In school, he spoke softly, not because he lacked opinion, but because he understood his voice had a price. Too much, and he was aggressive. Too little, and he was not leadership material. He learned how to balance on that razor's edge, to say enough to be heard, but never so much that someone would accuse him of making things about race, even when they were. He rose through the ranks quietly. Law school, federal service, televised hearings. Always composed, always courteous. The kind of man networks loved to book because he didn't yell, didn't interrupt, didn't break character. He was the controlled contrast to louder voices on stage, the calm they admired because they never asked what it took to maintain it. But beneath that composure, there was a record of small humiliations, 1,000 dismissals, none loud enough to make headlines. A mispronounced name the 5th time he visited the same newsroom. An anchor who asked before a segment, "Could you mention your parents?" It makes the story warmer. A mic left muted 2 seconds longer than everyone else's, just long enough to say, "We'll get to you eventually." These weren't crimes, but they were wounds. Wounds that never scarred, because they never fully healed. There was one memory he returned to often. A job interview, years ago. The executive leaned back in his chair and said, "You're clearly qualified, Kash. But I think we're looking for someone a little more relatable. You know what I mean." Patel had nodded. "Of course," he had said, "I understand." But he didn't. Not then. Not fully. Only later, after watching someone with half the credentials take the job and speak with twice the confidence, did he realize they weren't asking for relatability. They were asking for palatability. Years passed. He stayed silent. He endured. He outperformed. And every time someone made a joke, a small one, the kind that slips under the radar, the kind that ends in, "I'm just messing with you," he smiled. Not because he thought it was funny, but because they expected him to. And sometimes survival looks like complicity when it's really exhaustion. But not this time. Not on that panel. Not after all the years of swallowing the moment to protect the opportunity. Because something in him had shifted long before he stood up. And when the joke came, wrapped in charm, delivered with a practiced smile, Patel didn't think of rebuttals. He didn't think of optics. He thought of his father, a quiet man, hands hardened by work, accent softened only slightly over time. A man who once told him, "Never become so fluent in their language that you forget your own." And suddenly, Patel realized he had been fluent for too long. Too fluent in tolerance, too fluent in professional restraint, too fluent in making others comfortable at the cost of his dignity. So he stood, and in that 16-second clip that now echoed across millions of screens, you weren't just seeing a man walk off a show. You were seeing every moment he hadn't walked away from before. You were watching the dam break, quietly, finally, righteously, because the fire beneath his calm wasn't rage, it was history. And history has a way of showing up at the exact moment you thought you were in control and saying, "Not anymore." It didn't begin with a press release. There was no headline from a major outlet, no morning show roundtable, no expert analysis. It started as a murmur. A whisper passed between strangers who felt the same cold sting behind Patel's quiet exit. By midnight, the 16-second clip had been reposted over 500,000 times. Not because of what was said, but because of everything that wasn't. There was no branding, no logo, no endorsement. Only a grainy screen grab of Patel rising from his chair, mic in hand, jaw set, voice calm, words precise. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." Nothing more, nothing less. The internet didn't treat it like a meme. It treated it like a turning point. People didn't joke about it. They studied it. Clips began appearing with captions like, "This isn't a walk-off. It's a lesson in dignity. Every kid who's ever been underestimated, this one's for you." That wasn't a mic drop. That was a moral shift. Even more striking was who shared it. Professors, security guards, journalists, nurses, stay-at-home parents, teenagers. A librarian in Minnesota posted it with a simple message. "For every time I was told I was only there to check a box, this clip helped me breathe again." A woman in Atlanta wrote, "He didn't defend himself. He reminded them he didn't need to." Soon, celebrities picked it up, but they didn't try to center themselves. They just posted it quietly. No selfies, no hashtags, just reverence. An NBA player posted, "Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it just gets up and walks away." A best-selling author reposted the clip with the caption, "This is how a legacy begins, when someone decides a seat at the table isn't worth staying silent for." But the real shift came not from influencers or celebrities or media. It came from classrooms. High school teachers showed the clip before starting history discussions. One printed the quote on a whiteboard, "What happens when silence becomes the loudest thing in the room?" A fifth-grade teacher in Oakland played it and asked, "What do you notice about the way he stands up?" A girl in the back replied, "He doesn't yell. That's how you know he means it." Then came the essays, from students, from interns, from junior staffers at companies across the country who had felt what Patel had felt, even if they had never said it aloud. One essay stood out. It was written by a 22-year-old communications assistant for a private firm in Texas. It read, "I've smiled through too many jokes, laughed at too many comments, told myself I was being too sensitive, that I should be grateful to be in the room. But watching Patel walk away, not in anger but in quiet resolve, showed me that gratitude should never cost your self-respect." That essay was shared over 200,000 times in 3 days. The phrase "Patel pause" began trending. It wasn't meant to mock. It was a reminder, a movement of people choosing to stop, to not clap along, to not nod out of habit, to sit with the weight of words before speaking again. Some workplaces began opening meetings with the pause. 3 seconds of silence to acknowledge that dignity isn't always loud, but it's always present. And somewhere in Virginia, a mother sat with her teenage son. They watched the clip on her phone. He asked, "Why is everyone talking about this guy?" She paused, looked at the screen, then said, "Because he didn't try to win. He tried to be whole." The clip didn't fade by the end of the week. It didn't burn out like scandal or shock. It grew deeper. It wasn't about Kash Patel anymore. It was about what people saw in themselves when he stood up. They weren't watching a career moment. They were watching a reckoning. And they stayed. Not for drama, not for judgment. They stayed because in a world drowning in noise, someone had finally let silence speak. The network tried to fix it. 3 days after the clip hit 10 million views, a statement was released. Diplomatic, polished, painfully sterile. "We value the diverse perspectives of our guests. We regret that Mr. Patel felt the need to leave the discussion and welcome him back at any time to continue the conversation. No apology, no acknowledgement, just an open door they assumed he'd still want to walk through." But the country had already left the room. The viewers knew the difference between regret and responsibility, between a statement crafted by PR and a reckoning born in silence. And Patel? He didn't respond. Not publicly. Not right away. Instead, the next time the world saw him, he was standing behind a podium. Not at a talk show, but at a leadership summit in Boston. A different stage, a different audience, a different kind of power. The room was quiet when he walked out. Not reverent. Attentive. People didn't clap out of habit. They waited, as if the silence had followed him here and no one dared interrupt it. Patel stepped to the mic. He wasn't wearing a designer suit, no lapel pin, no handlers at the edge of the stage, just him, a binder, and the kind of presence that doesn't ask to be noticed, but can't be ignored. He looked out at the room, held the gaze, then began, "I've been asked what I meant when I said someone had made the biggest mistake of their career. And the truth is, I wasn't talking about her. I was talking about me." The room didn't breathe. Because for too long, I thought staying quiet was the cost of being respected. That endurance was dignity. That swallowing the insult made me stronger. But that day, I realized, the mistake wasn't what she said. It was that I let people say it for years. He paused. And the silence after? That wasn't a refusal to engage. It was the sound of me remembering who I am, without anyone else's permission. He let the words settle, then continued. "Some people think I walked away to make a scene. I didn't. I walked away because I finally understood the scene didn't deserve me." No raised voice, no spike in tone, just quiet authority, woven from decades of restraint and one moment of clarity. Then he closed his binder, but didn't leave the stage. He looked out again, his voice softer now. This isn't about a talk show, or a panel, or a joke. This is about knowing when to stop performing gratitude and start living your worth. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved, not because they were unsure how to react, but because they didn't want to break what had just been built. A space that didn't demand applause, just presence. That speech, 20 minutes long, was never advertised, never promoted. No camera crews, no sound bites crafted for clicks. But someone in the audience filmed it, posted it quietly, captioned it. He didn't burn the house down. He reclaimed his name from its basement. It went viral, yes, but slowly, like a seed taking root, not a fire catching wind. Clips from the speech were played at universities, referenced in boardrooms, whispered in backstage circles. One quote in particular spread everywhere. What we choose not to say still says everything. It was written in chalk outside a public library. It appeared on a coffee shop wall in Portland. It became the closing slide in a TEDx talk about ethical leadership. Back at the network, they tried again. Another email. This one more personal. Still no apology. Just a suggestion to come back on to clear the air. But Patel had moved on. Not because he was bitter, because he was done. And the public? They didn't demand a fight. They didn't want a rematch. They had already seen the answer. In a man who didn't flinch, didn't fight, and didn't fold. Who said only what needed to be said, then let the rest be learned in silence. In the days that followed Patel's speech, something strange began to happen. Not louder, not faster, calmer, more intentional. The clip of him walking out, once replayed for its shock, was now being dissected for its structure. The way he stood, the breath before he spoke, the precise cadence of his words. You just made the biggest mistake of your career. People didn't quote it with fire, they quoted it with gravity, like scripture recited softly, like a verdict you don't cheer for. You just feel in your chest. Commentators tried to spin it as political. They missed the point entirely. This wasn't about politics. It was about presence, about what power looks like when it isn't trying to dominate the room, when it doesn't need to yell to be heard, when it doesn't dress itself in applause or hide behind a performance. In a panel on media ethics, a journalist put it best. We've mistaken volume for conviction and showmanship for strength. Patel reminded us that the quietest person in the room is often the one paying the most attention. Power, people began to realize, had been misdefined. It wasn't always the one with the mic, or the one with the retort. It wasn't the one trending for being bold, or witty, or relentless. Sometimes, power is knowing when something isn't worth answering. Patel's silence had shifted the paradigm. Suddenly, the archetype of the strong figure, loud, brash, unapologetic, began to feel thin, obvious, performative. Against his stillness, their shouting looked juvenile, their theatrics desperate, their confidence rehearsed. In corporate circles, leadership coaches started invoking the Patel principle. Don't rush to speak. Don't fight every insult. Don't correct the room just to be right. Make them feel when you're no longer willing to be misread. And it wasn't just corporate. In high schools, students spoke up in class presentations with a new kind of clarity, pausing before answering, letting their ideas land fully without rushing to soften them. In law schools, young litigators practiced silence in mock trials, learning when not to object, when to let a question hang. In community centers, parents told their children, "You don't always have to explain yourself. Sometimes not explaining is what teaches others the most." And as for Patel, he didn't post motivational quotes. He didn't capitalize on the moment. He didn't sit down for exclusive interviews or sign a book deal. He just returned to work. But when he walked into rooms now, people sat up straighter, not out of fear, out of recognition, because he had redefined what authority looked like, not through dominance, but through alignment with self, with worth, with boundaries that don't require debate, the kind of authority that comes from not needing to be believed to still be undeniable. Months later, during a summit on civic leadership, a fellow speaker introduced him not with his resume, but with a sentence. He didn't say much, but we haven't stopped listening since. And in the audience, someone whispered to their neighbor, "That's the kind of power I want to grow into, the kind that doesn't come from being right, but from being whole." What happened next wasn't a headline. It wasn't an outrage cycle. There was no scandal, no leaked emails, no backlash protest. It was quieter than that, but deeper. A shift, not overnight, not with noise, but like a tide pulling something loose from beneath the surface. People started pausing before speaking, literally, a 3-second pause, inspired by a man who walked away without raising his voice. They called it the number Patel pause. It started in classrooms. Teachers gave students a moment before responding to a tough question, not to search for the right answer, but to own their voice, without rushing, without pleasing. Then it moved to workplaces. Team meetings ended with a prompt. What did we not say that mattered? Executives spoke last. Interns didn't feel the need to interrupt themselves with self-deprecating jokes. Some didn't speak at all. They just nodded. And that was enough. In churches, pastors referenced Patel not by name, but by principle. We are taught to turn the other cheek, but maybe what matters is knowing when to leave the room before the next slap comes. Public speakers shifted tone, not performative restraint, but measured gravity. Silence became a part of the rhythm, a breath between each point, an invitation to absorb rather than react. A TEDx presenter in Chicago ended their talk by stepping away from the mic, standing still for 5 seconds and saying, "Some truths don't need a defense, just space." The room stood in silence, and the phrase, "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," it took on new life. Not as a threat, not as revenge, but as awareness. It began appearing not in insults, but in internal reflections. A woman at a tech firm whispered it to herself after sitting through yet another meeting where her ideas were ignored, then echoed minutes later by someone louder. She didn't confront them. She didn't demand credit. She just didn't bring it up again. And when they came to her to fix what they couldn't build, she looked up and said, "I'm not available," and walked away. In Washington, a senator paraphrased Patel during a televised committee hearing. "We are not obligated to entertain every insult just because it's wrapped in policy." That line was clipped and reposted under the caption, "The number sign Patel effect." Even late-night comedians known for cynical punchlines treated the moment differently. One host opened a monologue with the clip, but didn't make a joke. Instead, he said, "This isn't satire. It's a mirror, and if you flinch, maybe it's because you see yourself in it." At an all-girls high school in Ohio, a counselor printed Patel's quote on a poster, "Not every room is worth staying in, especially the ones that ask you to shrink to fit." Next to it, she wrote a challenge. Write one sentence you've never said out loud because you didn't think they'd let you finish it. Dozens of students replied. None signed their names. None had to. The poster stayed up all semester. It wasn't about Patel the person anymore. It was about what he represented. A quiet correction to how we measure credibility, how we reward composure, how we interpret silence. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't weakness, it was intention. It was the truth delivered not with noise, but with permission withdrawn. People used to chase the spotlight. Now, more were asking, "Why am I here? What am I allowing by staying silent? And do I still want to? For decades we were taught that power meant not flinching, that success meant smiling through discomfort, that strength meant never walking away. But slowly, because of one moment, those definitions began to bend, reform themselves, not into rebellion, but into something more lasting. Respect that didn't need to ask, dignity that didn't need to be declared, power that didn't need to be performed. And in a world addicted to noise, one man's choice to walk away became the sound everyone finally heard. He didn't plan a comeback. He didn't need one. But when Kash Patel returned to a public stage, it wasn't to reclaim control. It was to redefine the conversation, not as a guest, not as a rebuttal, but as a moderator. The event? A televised town hall on representation and restraint. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The network that once dismissed his presence had extended the invitation. This time, they didn't seat him at the edge. They placed him at the center. But even if they hadn't, he would have owned the space. Not because of what he'd done, because of who he had quietly become. The set was minimalist. No flashy graphics, no dramatic intros, just a semicircle of chairs and a round table. There were no applause signs, no studio laughter. The producer said, "We're letting the audience decide what matters." A lesson learned and not forgotten. Patel walked onto the stage with no entourage, no mic check, just presence. He greeted the panelists, all from vastly different backgrounds, activists, writers, business leaders, a high school senior, a former senator. He didn't open with a quote. He opened with a question. How do we move forward in a culture that rewards the loudest voice, but silences the most thoughtful one? The question didn't spark debate. It sparked reflection. One by one, each panelist responded, not to impress, not to compete, but to contribute. Patel didn't dominate the conversation. He guided it. Gently, like someone steering a ship through fog without needing to sound the horn. He asked follow-ups that didn't provoke. They revealed. He gave the quietest speaker the most time. And when someone tried to interrupt, he simply raised a hand and said, "Let's let the thought finish." It wasn't a correction. It was a reminder that not everything we say needs to be cut short to fit a segment. Halfway through the town hall, someone asked him directly, "You could have returned to any platform, why this one?" He paused, then smiled slightly. "Because I wanted to come back not where I was heard the least, but where I was assumed the least." The audience was silent again, not because they were unsure, because they were holding something, a moment, a lesson, a shift in how dialogue could feel when ego steps aside. In the final minutes of the town hall, a college student in the front row raised his hand and asked, "If you could speak to the version of yourself sitting on that panel the day you walked out, what would you say?" Patel didn't rush his answer. He looked down, took a breath, then said, "I'd say you're not overreacting. You're just finally reacting. And sometimes that's what growth looks like. The moment you stop adjusting to what hurts you quietly." There was no thunderous applause, no standing ovation, just people standing slowly, deliberately, not to cheer, but to acknowledge. The kind of silence that says, "We heard that. We're still hearing it." After the event, Patel didn't stay for photos. He thanked the crew, spoke briefly with the student who had asked the final question, and walked to the edge of the stage. A technician offered to escort him out. He declined. He exited through the back, where no cameras followed. But someone in the audience, a community organizer from Milwaukee, wrote on social media that night, "He walked off a stage months ago and changed the way we talk. Tonight he returned and reminded us how to listen." The return wasn't about vindication. It wasn't about being right. It was about showing that true presence doesn't expire. It resurfaces, quietly, surely, when the world is finally ready to meet it where it stands. There was no confetti, no viral follow-up, no glossy article titled "The Return of Kash Patel." He simply faded from the spotlight, the same way he had entered it, deliberately, unshaken, complete. But the moment he created didn't fade. It lingered, in unexpected places, in silent rooms, in pauses people didn't rush to fill. At a university in Oregon, a professor printed Patel's quote and taped it above a doorway. "You're not overreacting. You're just finally reacting." Students walked beneath it on their way to speak, not louder, but more truthfully. At a church in North Carolina, a preacher told a story about someone who walked away not in protest, but in peace. He didn't name Patel. He didn't have to. And somewhere in a small Midwestern town, a father showed his teenage daughter the clip for the first time. She watched, silently. When it ended, he said, "That's how you leave a room when it doesn't see your value." She nodded, not because she fully understood, but because she wanted to. The phrase, "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," had changed shape. It was no longer about an insult, or a walkout, or a moment gone viral. It had become a line people repeated when they realized they had tolerated too much, too long, from systems that made them prove they belonged before they were allowed to simply exist. In New York, a mural appeared on the side of a community center. It wasn't Patel's face. It was just a chair, empty, a mic left on the table. Beneath it, 3 words. He walked away. Nothing more. But everyone who passed it knew exactly what it meant. And still, Patel said nothing. No podcast appearances, no merchandise, no memoir titled "The Moment." But people noticed something. Every time he entered a room, a briefing, a summit, a hearing, he began by looking at everyone present. 3 seconds, no smile, no gesture, just a scan, as if silently asking, "Are we ready for honesty yet?" It unsettled some, it centered others, but no one looked away. At a university lecture 6 months later, a student asked a guest speaker, "How do you make change without being confrontational?" The guest, an educator, paused, then smiled. "You ever hear of the man who said 12 words, then didn't say another one for 3 months, and still made half the country reevaluate what they think power looks like?" The student nodded. "That's how." And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't post a rebuttal. She didn't spiral into scandal. She paused, disappeared for a while, then quietly returned with less charm and more care. In one interview, months later, she was asked if she had any regrets that year. She paused, 3 seconds, then said, "I wish I'd realized not every joke needs to be said just because the room is smiling. Especially when you don't know who's in the room." It wasn't an apology. It didn't need to be. At a TEDx forum in California, a high school student took the stage. Her topic, "The Day We Relearned Stillness." She opened with a single line. "I used to think strength meant not being interrupted. Now, I think it means knowing when not to continue." And in a bookstore in Atlanta, taped behind the cashier's desk, hung a small photo. No text, no branding. Just an older man, walking away from a stage, hands at his sides, no spotlight. The caption, handwritten beneath it, read, "Not every revolution is loud. Some just leave the room first." That's what stayed. Not the line, not the meme, not the moment. The stillness, the recalibration, the reminder that in a world obsessed with spectacle, sometimes the most powerful act is to say just enough, and then stop. Kash Patel didn't become a symbol. He became a standard, not because he demanded it, but because we needed one. And maybe that's the lesson we'll carry forward, the legacy of a moment that didn't need volume to create change. That presence, real presence, doesn't shout, doesn't plead, doesn't demand attention. It simply stands, waits, and when necessary, walks.